Hello everyone, today we talk about the periodization of the Middle Ages, which is definitely one of the most difficult, if not useless, things, as we will see today, we can do ever, as it's widely known. The Middle Ages never existed as such, at least if not from the mind of someone who started, from the 15th century and started seeing it this period, conceiving it as such. But historically speaking, it definitely doesn't make sense. And periodizing is definitely something important. I'm not one of those people who says, periodizing is stupid because just, it's all an approximation, it's all a convention, so we shouldn't do it. Because indeed, scanning time and to reorganize it in periods is definitely an intellectual activity that is typical of every historian that wants to understand the past. So the historian here is not to be meant, the guy who has a sheet of paper that says, you're a historian, because we're all historians in some way. We all research, and this is our human condition, we can say. So every time we understand the past, and it's even our brain works indeed, because cognitively speaking, we need certain fixed approximations, certain wild approximations as well, that we have to stick to essentially orientate ourselves. And that's really how our process of learning works. So we need periodizations. Especially the more better, the less we know. That's why we periodize chiefly in schools, and that's what we tell. Oh, in schools they teach you this. It's all well, of course, because kids need also to learn that way. So it's obvious that from a certain point of view, it's better for them, even maybe to assimilate that approximation, to at least know what we are talking about, and then eventually, when they're older, they start getting a better understanding of the wall. Some people say, well, whatever, this is maybe not important, but even for adults, it's definitely useful to give a logical sense to the events by trying to identify, if anything, the most important problematic joints, we can say. So the characteristic, the typical characteristics of one epoch, or maybe the reasons of continuity. That's why you can also interpret history like that, or the moments of change, or a fracture of what appears to be a sort of breakdown of previous patterns. So these are all viable options you can use wherever you have to go and to learn history, and to try to go deeper into it, because it's natural even to picture it in your mind initially like that. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So this is an activity that has a obvious utility on at a sociological level. But, and this is as well obvious as well, because of its own nature, it is definitely also a quite volative and an arbitrary um, activity as well. So that the it's always debatable. Never think, when people say, "Oh well, things started here and ended there." Whoever this person is, doesn't matter whether it's a university professor or the average no one you take from the streets. Be always aware that this is debatable. That such ideas are always debatable, because there is not a single periodizing definition, accommodation, if you want, that makes definitely fully sense. Never. So people were so stubborn because everything changed from this moment onwards. Are you sure? Are you sure? And this is what I would like to make you understand now, before getting into the Middle Ages proper, is it's really a even a moral duty. Because you see, even if there are such important moments, etc., of which we want to stress the importance because they definitely had an enormous impact on our life. First of all, we have to value this maybe as a consequence of a phenomenon. Hmm? It maybe broke out in that way because certain contingencies brought to it, so that this changed everything in such a manner that we feel the need to say, okay, well, this is kind of watershed, whatever it is. But at the same time, that event is still framed into a series of other processes, phenomena, dynamics, whatever you want to call them, that also produce it, and are in this sense other other branches that maybe are going the way that they are going, and this is pretty evident that they're all intertwined. But just to make an example, if you take a dramatic, let's say every kind of event that is normally taken as, this is where everything changed. You still have to think that, and normally we associate this to things like politics and war, usually in our history, because that's something that as humans has definitely a very important impact on us, also emotionally speaking. But in that context, take things like economy, for instance. There are wars that definitely change the world, for instance, but they're still framed into economical patterns that never end, not really end there, not really have much of, just think about how 1929 crisis has been for World War II, both in its causes and both in how objectively the world economy was developing in the 30s and the 40s. And that's not something you can say, well, okay, in 1939 Hitler invaded Poland, so that's everything has changed, because in that event is still, something that a lot was going on. It is all intertwined, and it's as if, at least I personally have this. I also have these approximations going on in my mind when I think about history, and the most I have a very plastic imagination. My I see as if it was a river, a stream, and there were all these currents that basically are intertwined, and you can maybe singularly identify it or more or less having the perception of, but you can't really say where one begins and the other ends. I mean, when you look strict at it, you say, okay, well, this goes on its own. But if you take a closer look, you realize, first of all, it never stops, never idles, and then it's intertwined with all the rest. So, how can you periodize in something like this? And especially, why do you have to do it? Because why it's, how it's obviously, we just said it, we can't. I mean, we can by approximating and therefore always being imprecise. But why? And the why is naturally something we're going to see in a bit, in a deeper way, for the Middle Ages, because the Middle Ages in this process is excruciatingly difficult to periodize. It's especially for the Middle Ages, probably there's been a great anxiety of periodization. Yeah, I know, with this happens more or less with all the ages. Just think about the modern and the contemporary era, when it is that the contemporary era starts, with the 7 Years' War, with the French Revolution, with the Congress of Vienna, with when is it right that contemporary history, that there is also kind of wild chain, but at least at that point it's okay. There are infinite debates, but there is as if there was much more security whether what the modern age and the contemporary age were. When you take the Middle Ages, you realize that there is a sort of negative process, because the Middle Ages, it has not, historically speaking, as a concept, is not being carved as something on its own. That is being developed later. In the way it was conceived initially, was essentially a dark hole between other ages that were conceived instead as something quite precisely definable. Especially in that at that moment in the past, because the concept of the Middle Ages, as we were saying, was created by the humanists at the end of the same Middle Ages. There is at least a beautiful irony that humanists are considered today medievals themselves, so they kind of backfired on them. But at that point, it was something conceived as a moment of renaissance after essentially one millennium of we don't know really what. So this Middle Age that was between this period of renewal and the fast, let's say, of the pomp of the ancient world, the greatness of the ancient world. So, and when we look at how the problems we have now, especially to periodize the Middle Ages, we realize that we clash against extremely complex problems. So, exactly for this, because this is a period that's being carved not, in fact, as a meaningful moment per se, but essentially as a negative object that was counterposed to other periods that were other epochs, eras, how you want to call them, ages, that were different, surely, but also were also better, ideally speaking. And don't believe that people are still reasoning in very different fashion from humanists today. Lots of people objectively believe today, in the 21st century, that the Middle Ages was somewhat a negative period of sorts. And that I don't really like to indulge into subjective judgments and so on, but I have an enormous contempt towards people who reason in this way. I mean, if they're they're not maybe that involved into history and they don't know much, I can't understand it, because obviously people repeat what they hear. But for anyone who has a minimal historical knowledge, and saying that the Middle Ages it was a dark period is having basically misunderstood not just the Middle Ages but the world history as such. I mean, also the other epochs in the first place. And this is kind of the nicest thing I can say towards it, because usually I recur to insults, and I definitely see evil in here, because it's not just a matter of ignorance. It's objectively a wicked ideological position that I'm fine with ignorance, as we are all ignorance by definition, because in fact it's innocuous in itself. The problem is when people get that enough tiny amount of knowledge to start thinking that arrogantly that they know best, and they have to start judging over things they do not know. That's really the worst, and that's negative in my opinion, even exactly ethically speaking, because it's as if you were talking of someone who do not know, and you can see history also a bit like that, and by personifying this, I mean, think of all the people who lived into the Middle Ages. Do you think they deserved to be remembered as people who lived in a Middle Age, as medievals, and thinking they were just a bunch of ignorant scum that with obscurantistic views and being wicked and evil and so on? I personally, when I hear these things, I feel like I think into my guts. It feels like as if I wanted to cry for these people, because we are so stupid to ever think something like this in the first place. I'm not making the point, whoever lived in the Middle Ages was such a good person. But that's not the point. I'm not making that point. But I'm making the point that, well, this is getting complicated because it's a bit of a philosophy of history. But let's say the Middle Ages was not better or worse than other ages. Ages are not intrinsically better or worse. There are people who might be better or worse in the same, morally speaking. This is true, but also in here, it's not something you can attach to, because every person is a different person. So you can approximate for even two people together. You can approximate for a world age for I think billions of people, that lived into the Middle Ages, as continuatively summing up all the population over this period of time. And this is just a banal concept, but kind of gives you the idea. And I would just like to give you a look to think, I don't know, medieval architecture, medieval art, medieval logistics of the improvements in economy and accounting. It's true that technologically speaking there wasn't a big deal of advancements, but even optics, something that consistently advanced at the time, there was a great renewal of technology in its application. Think about the juridical development of the Middle Ages. Think about the political theory of the Middle Ages. Think about the moral tensions of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are a moment in which, from which we have kind of learned, or at least it become widespread, to think that what happened within you is more important than what what the law says. It's very important because law is made by men, while your soul is kind of sacred in this sense. So you always have, and you can obviously secularize this because obviously it's a Christian principle, but it's the moment in which we began to say, okay, we have a moral duty also towards one another. Don't think that what happened in the Middle Ages was something extraneous to what eventually philosophers systematized into the modern age, as in terms of individual freedom, because these were and ethical choices and to be true towards oneself and the others, because conceptually speaking, that was present, arguably also from the ancient world, but in the Middle Ages was something that permeated the whole society. Even Christianism, that is also very sometimes, well, we'll say it later, but there is a kind of negative stigma attached from our modern secular mentality to even the fact that Middle Ages was all kind of religious repressive world. But this is also had to be actually, the modern age has been much more religiously repressive than the Middle Ages, if we want to be honest. And these are complicated things, but just to make you understand how you can't look at the Middle Ages as anything particularly, I don't know, that you can't judge an age as better or worse. Doesn't make sense. All it counts is its history as a research to let you understand how that world was and how it worked. That is already an amazing feat to do. So if you're someone who was never even bothered him or herself to look at the Middle Ages in positive terms, because you have just repeated, absorbed what you have heard by other people who said it as a negative period. Maybe it's not even your fault, because maybe you have not had the chance to see it in another way, but just think it's not true. And we don't say it because we have a particular sympathy toward the Middle Ages. I am a medievalist, but for instance, and obviously I have a sympathy toward the Middle Ages, but in the moment in which I am a historian proper, I don't care about the Middle Ages. First of all, it doesn't exist to me. Secondly, I love any other time in history. I don't have preferences, not even of space. Of course, and also in here, it's easier to appreciate what you know from a certain perspective, so it's obvious that, I don't know, I know arguably much more about the Middle Ages than, and I don't know, the Western Middle Ages than I know of any other times and space in history, because it's obvious. But this doesn't make me favor it more than another time. I read all the time about ancient history, modern history, contemporary history. I'm extremely passionate about it, and exactly because I know kind of the Middle Ages quantitatively best, I I feel the need also to expand my knowledge into other times and space, and I don't see any barrier. This is probably the best service you can render to history, not to put stakes, not to put stakes, poles, like saying, this is where it begins and it ends, because it doesn't really make a big deal of sense. Excuse me, I drink a little bit once again. So it's exactly this or this originary character of if you want fake and artificial invention, that the Middle Ages is extremely mm, kind of unsuitable for any um, like to be pictured as a unique body. Mm. So if you take the 5th or the 6th century, wherever usually it's between the 5th, the Middle Ages is between the 5th and 15th century AD. Mm. And if you look at this moment, it's 1,000 years. First of all, it's not a few. It's true that the ancient history, in this sense, is considered as a longer time, but obviously, if you take into consideration the modern age, the contemporary age, they're significantly shorter. Ancient times are so long, also because there is, in fact, kind of mythical conception of it, but also the ancient times get segmented. Indeed, if you take classical times, Hellenistic times, I'd say Bronze Age, then late antiquity, that is also a very important thing. So also in there we kind of segment in shorter chunks, and also in there it all depends also on the nature of the sources of how much we practically know about that world. We know enormously more about the Middle Ages than we know about the ancient world. This is also a paradox, that the Middle Ages are so beautifully documented and people don't care. There are reasons for this, because it's definitely easier to learn about ancient history than to learn about the Middle Ages. For this exact reason, then there is also mainly also the problem of the continuity, as moderns we're kind of obsessed by the concept of empires, of great powers, and so on. So since in the ancient world it was more political unity on average, the Middle Ages seemed, this, and you can orientate on them. So if you say, I don't know, I want to learn Roman history, well, you know what Roman history is about, because there's always been a Rome from one moment, from starting from some point onwards, so that you can trace the history of that specific entity up to wherever you want. And also here there is the problem, because many people stop to just on the fall of the Western half of the Roman Empire, while indeed actually the Roman Empire continues till the very end of the Middle Ages, and usually also the fall of Constantinople can be interpreted together with the incidentally in the same year of the end of the 100 Years' War as the end of the Middle Ages. But you realize that in 1,000 years, I was saying the Middle Ages doesn't have anything like this, because it does have certain entities that lived somewhat for throughout all its time. In fact, the same Byzantine Empire as such as the Roman Empire. But if you look at the rest, it's definitely a very politically fragmented era in many ways. So people have difficulties to focus on the whole picture, and this is very dramatic for me when thinking about the Middle Ages, because I realized that when approaching medieval history, people keep indulging into certain prejudices and stereotypes that also are very disgustingly narrow-minded. Many people just like to concentrate on the history of their own tiny, let's say, more or less tiny reality. Maybe, I don't know, because it's their countries, because they have a particular sympathy, and they wildly ignore all the rest as a system that was influencing its country anymore. How many people are obsessed with let's not make strict examples, but people even take the Middle Ages as this moment of, I don't know, of purity, like, oh, I like that lifestyle, it was so good, because it attaches ideological concepts to it. It pretends the Middle Ages were a sort of uncontaminated originary moment of the, in fact, of how when the roots were based. It wasn't anything like that. The world has always been changing wildly. Those roots are understandable only if you understand them as being rooted into something else, in turn, um, you and this happens all the time. And you realize that most of the people who appreciate that specific context, especially with the Middle Ages, you realize it's mostly because they're kind of like the lifestyle, they like this alleged roughness that existed, more than, I don't know, into other ages, according to them. They have this kind of good savage stereotype that for which they want to love the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were nothing like that, as a matter of fact. The Middle Ages were civilization. There weren't something like bunch of, of guys just, fighting from dawn to sunset just for the sake of it, going to rabbit. It was a much more built world. It was a much more complex world than we imagine. And it's exactly that fragmentation that paradoxically stemmed a much greater dynamism and inventiveness, resourcefulness, and creativity that it had existed into the ancient world, for instance. It's pretty self-evident that the Middle Ages was a much more effervescent and dynamic world than the Roman one. There's also been magnified. There are studies I've seen that show how the ancient world was something enormous from us in terms of social complexity towards the Middle Ages. How can you say that? How can you objectively say that? In terms of sheer, just if you combine the demographics and the economics, you realize this is not possible in the first place. Because 13th century Europe is already a much more thriving and overly hyperkinetic system than the Roman Empire. Its peak really was in terms of, at least, of dynamism. I don't want necessarily to say it about social complexity, because also the Roman world was kind of more onto those tracks that in the essential didn't really. The Middle Ages had a much greater potential, first of all, and especially that was being put into practice. I know there are people who are very dogmatic about this. You can argue that I am being as well, but maybe I will try to prove I'm not, maybe on some other video, which I will be more precise on this topic. But just for saying that the Middle Ages have been, mistreated, ill-treated, just and criticized for no reason, ultimately, just for aggrandizing other periods in history, because we need to feel sometimes also there's been some kind of progress, and we need to identify in history, and we need to identify certain moments in history as if they were I don't know, better or worse, because it makes us feel confident and happy that there is a positive world, that the humans can reach greatness, and as well as they can reach darkness, and we need to feel that. It's also an extremely moralistic view of history that is made also for most of the time for very ideological reasons, because and this is in fact a view of history that is not present in all the countries in the same way. There are countries in the world that have this more this greater obsession with strictly moralistic approaches to history, not looking at history like an activity or something progressive, something difficult. I mean, the most problematic. Today we tend to look at history as a problematic thing in the first place, because after hundreds of hundreds of years of ideologism, we found out that the way we used to talk about history is kind of wrong, because we gave for granted so many things in terms of definitions, of approximations, that now we're realizing in many other fields, even scientific ones, that something doesn't work objectively, and we have to reformulate, we have to come up with new theories, we have in fact to advance from the point we are. Because indeed also historiography advanced, and you never dismiss older historiography as non-important, because all the historiography might have been less accurate, less precise, but it's definitely the mean that allowed us to start to realize it in the first place. So we have to be thankful always to older historiographers, even if they were, I don't know, sometimes they were scum because they were strongly ideologically oriented and so on. And we are like a bit like them today as well. So we never changed. We are always the same people. But looking at them, and this is something I like to do because very often I like to read maybe authors from, I don't know, late 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, and I say, you know what, these guys actually had it, most of it right. Of course, there is something that is approximated, there is something simply they didn't know before because also research progresses and so on. But they had a very clear vision. Also, the way we look at history, yeah, today it's better from a strictly, in terms of accuracy, but it's still, the people who make history still have lost certain qualities of the great scholars of the past, including the medieval ones, because believe it or not, but the Middle Ages were extremely important also for historiography and the way to look at the world, especially. And we have a lot of things to learn from medieval times in this sense. Also in the way to look at history. Medievals had a beautiful mind. It's unfortunate that I won't have the time now to explain it because I have really to talk a lot today, but I promise I will get into these topics individually in other dedicated videos. So just to make the long story short, during the 19th century, especially those positivistic scholars, towards the second half of the 19th century and also the beginning of the 20th century, had a very peculiar approach to history because they felt the need, the necessity. They felt the necessity not to make history, that is, to research a sense in history. And this was actually, it has pros and cons in history, but they try to basically to limitate themselves to construct very, very I don't know even to say, in a punctiliously way, in an obstinate and stubborn way, the on the base of naturally of documentary evidence, the single sequences of the so-called facts. The facts, I want facts, I want hard facts. Sometimes when I Google on certain things on especially about history, I find things like, I don't know, the Norman conquest of England, facts, because people still today are obsessed. They want facts, they want sheer facts, they want evidence, hardcore evidence. They need to take the sheer massive fact that you can't alter. So this is a mindset that is still pretty much out here. It's the idea you can't know the truth, you can't know reality, you can be right and other people can be wrong. This is how still many people look at history a bit, and so these authors, as you understand, have still been pretty influential in our history. They basically refused to treat began to refuse to treat as a unitary ensemble these so-called dark ages, because this is paradoxical. They were doing something good now. They were the first ones who were saying, okay, this Middle Ages weren't a wall block as such. But at the same time, I still considered them in negative ways because they were, at this time, in positivistic times, these scholars were also still very influenced in a very radical way by the Enlightenment and its criticism towards the Middle Ages. We might have started a bit earlier and looking at, what the historiography, especially from humanism onwards, was towards the Middle Ages. We kind of, but I think more or less and we're gonna repeat it also in this video a little bit, but not framed now in this sequence that I'm making. So the sad thing about this process, or that, however, has to be understood also historically, because historiography is important. It's as if you made the history of history, right? And you can understand so many things about those specific times when a certain historiography was produced to make you understand what the mentality also of those times practically were. So these scholars basically they judged basically they started to highlight within the same Middle Ages those moments of rebirth, and those in which that nothing seemingly that everything had remained, to which everything had remained static. So, for instance, certain authors began to say things, just to make it more simple, because I realized I didn't explain it well, but it's as if, many authors said, okay, the Middle Ages ended into around the year 1000, because after the year 1000, things started to progress again, typical positivistic mindset of the 19th century. So the Middle Ages was ended, because the Middle Ages equates to Dark Age, and the Dark Age was only what existed before the year 1000, because those were, there is no apparent progress, which is also false, according as much as we can tell today, as far as we can tell today. And then the Middle Ages began to rise once again, so it's something else. So they were actually buying the preconceived notions that the Middle Ages were a dark age, and were now just trying to save certain moments of it, because seemingly there was a progress, just as there was being into the 19th century. That positivism was this moment in which there had been practically the second industrial revolution, also even before, actually. Also in here it's an approximation, but with industrial revolutions it was this idea of that we still live in, pretty much, that the world is gonna progress anyway. And we know, everybody who knows something about theory economics perfectly knows that the world is not gonna grow all the time, and we got to use certain rhythms of growth that are not necessarily have to be met, because the two industrial revolutions weren't born, also the others. Today I think we arrived to the fifth by according to certain scholars, but let's say the two most meaningful ones arguably were the ones of the 18th and the one of the late 19th centuries. Were happening to a moment because there was a potential in here. It's also mostly a very physical concept, a very physical. There was a very physical reason behind this. So this idea, this obsession that things have to better, that there has to be progress. How many people buy also this preconceived notion of progress? The idea, we will rocket sometimes. We'll have to do. In the year 2000, we had to live on Mars and just get fed with pills and not with meals. And I think I like better to still be on the Earth and still eating my my food in my meal in dishes and so on. It's this illusion, this delusion as well, that things have always to go better. And it's not all negative, because it's fine. It's what we humans are programmed for. We want always to better, but not necessarily is this going to happen. Also, not always, arguably at no time, but probably never as much as now, humans had, as a whole, as a species, full control over the development of their own society. Today we arrived into a moment in which, when we were hunter-gatherers, we had a decent control on our own society. Today, objectively, how much do you know about the world? The world is so complex, nobody in the world, in fact, understands the world. We can all have our own field of expertise, but let's be honest about it. How much do we know about it? How can we control it? It's very difficult. This doesn't mean we cannot improve, but this is not necessarily teleologically happen. We can take teleology definitely as a positive thing for ourselves, hoping that this will happen, that there is always going to be a better time. Of course, this is what the driving force of our society should be, indeed. but you can expect it to concretely happen all the time. On the contrary, for instance, in the Middle Ages, they thought that the world was kind of orbis senescit, was, the world is aging. So it was believed that indeed from the time of the creation and the terrestrial paradise, things were going progressively worse up to the come of the Antichrist, and then of Christ would crush him, and then when the kingdom of heaven would take over. So different views also of history of time, never to be forgotten. However, this was not the point, but just for saying how 19th century historians also influenced massively certain things. You still hear today many people use ideas and concepts and terms that were coined in the 19th century by positivistic scholars. Also, and especially when talking about the Middle Ages. There is, I was hinting at it before, all this other branch of interpretation that has to deal with the religious view of the Middle Ages. This is something very important because also in here, different countries have different approaches to history. You have, countries like Germany that had something so devastating like the 30 Years' War that wiped out 1/3 of its population, left this massive shock for which in Germany today, even when you sign up in a university, you have to declare which religion you are. For instance, there are countries like Italy that never had religious clashes. So this, there are basically different approaches that also have to do a lot with our own sensitivity, our own way of looking at the world in more or less moral terms. This is important as well because it's not necessarily better or worse, but it gives different results. So the main debate also relatively to the Middle Ages, so now we go a bit back in time in historiography, is the very bitter debate that existed between, especially this started during the 16th century, so from 16th century onwards indeed, between Protestants and Catholics, relatively to the Middle Ages. That is this idea that from the Protestant side, obviously the idea is the Middle Ages have been a moment dominated by Roman Catholicism, at least in the West, of course. And then kind of the Middle Ages ends because Martin Luther pops out, the Reformation, the world indeed splits, but and obviously from a Protestant point of view, this has been a progress because the Protestants always, everyone backs, its own side. Same for the Catholics that instead during the Counter-Reformation began to say, okay, look, let's also begin to tell our own history, the history of the papacy in the Middle Ages, from, in fact, trying to understand how it really was and giving it a positive meaning overall. So there were these two currents into Europe that went in parallel, each own telling the Middle Ages from their own religious perspective and giving an idea of it. And however, these two opinions had one very important thing in common that influenced all the rest of historiography. That is the idea that there was a substantially unitary picture of the Middle Ages from a religious point of view. Because nobody was debating in this sense that Roman Catholicism was the only thing that existed. And this was also an approximation. And it stemmed from less specific confessional clashes, period of confessional clashes into the modern age. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. During the modern age, into which the Protestants were accusing Rome, and Rome instead was praising itself. So, but nobody shifted from the concept of Rome, or thinking that the Roman Church was not the unique religious, let's say, pole. We can say, I don't know how to define this. There have been other authors, however, in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century mostly, that curiously all came from Italy, who instead began to say, you know what, there is not just this or better. There were usually Catholic scholars, but they started to give certain interpretations of it, to which our authors responded, essentially looking at the Christian, um, the Middle Ages were not all about just the Church of Rome. Hmm? I mean, not diminishing obviously the importance that the Roman Church had on the Middle Ages, but let's say there were other experiences, um, other communities, other mindsets that also within the same Roman Church were quite varied. So the because this mm, in part still up to the mid 20th century there were these views of the church was something unitary, and that the Middle Ages was interpreted as a great spiritual history more than else. Many people started to say, look, this is not really true. This is not really true, and this is also very complex to go into detail in, because it's very complicated. We don't have time, but the let's say the ghost of the Middle Ages has been built much also on this idea of a sort of a unitary religious tension towards a certain direction. Most recent historiography, and not so recent, I mean also from those times in the mid 20th century, began to say this is substantially not true, because the let's leave aside those areas where we're naturally not even Christian for up to a certain point, or where paganism persisted in several forms. So, but there were so many different proposals, so many different views of looking at his, and there are certain different confessions that indeed also originated into the Middle Ages. Think about the Valdensians, that also, but there are many actually. So it was a word of great, also in here, of great fluidity from a religious point of view, as the Middle Ages can be observed as a moment of, as a meeting ground and of contamination between different cultures that cannot be separated, but they necessarily have that didn't fracture in this sense, but they, on the contrary, they stuck together. Mm-hmm. In a sort of syncretic vocation, as Jermex puts it, of different and of experiences that were apparently far and even contrasted, but that they somehow formed a system that worked broadly, even sometimes on a social institutional base, and that was all one also with other economical, juridical orders, and that felt, that had this different ways of living and of feeling. I know it's complicated, but indeed the Middle Ages was a moment of great syncretism. Was a moment of a paradoxically, religion was a gluing factor more than something that separated. Paradoxically, it's mostly during the modern age that religion became in some ways the dividing factor. Even the same Reformation is something that objectively could have been avoided in the idea of unity that even Luther actually wanted to stay to. I mean, Luther didn't do what he did just to secede, to create a schism, but objectively to answer a moral question. There was a lot of a miscomprehension at those point. The Reformation could be avoided. There was nothing else in there, nothing teleological about it. Everything could be solved if only both sides had been more reasonable, actually, because the schism stays both on the head of the Roman Church and the one on the Protestants. Um, but they were substantially part of a unique world. This is in fact how we have to see it, because our view is still massively influenced by the fact that there's been this fracture. In the 16th century, you have to imagine that the greatest trauma ever was not having discovered a new world, or that the Ottomans were invading Europe, or say the main trauma that affected in a Freudian way Western society forever has been the schism, has been the fracture of Christianity. That was the worst thing that happened, mentally speaking, psychologically speaking, and in those times. And we still respond to this because we automatically, say, at least I was raised thinking, even if I don't have any interest, I've never been ideologically fueled in those sense, but just to make an example, to when I was little and I read atlases of the world, there was all the list of countries, and every country had religion. It was like this. These are Protestants, these are Catholic, these are and so on. So it's as if that had been the frame you have to reason in. But it's never really been so. There have always been many points of contact, many points of meeting ground, things we had in common. And the Middle Ages was essentially this. So that even if, for instance, religious tolerance as starts appearing from the 17th century was not known, because the Middle Ages was not really a tolerant world in terms of religious theory, but nevertheless it was a world where there was a balance. So you could go in places and see Christians, Jews, Muslims living together, for instance. Also, the epopee of the Crusades, this idea, the world was split. From one side it was the Christians, from one side the Muslims. Ooh, what a terrible thing. It wasn't anything like that, because anyone who has studied the political military history of the Crusades know that, and this also a very important field of research today. We're noticing that these powers acted, use the religion basically as an excuse, as I believe it's always been in every time in history, most of the times, to do essentially what they were keeping to do for other interests. It have always been, obviously, economical interests, and I'm not making rhetoric here. Naturally, it was much more than that, but the essentials of those. You want to seize greater power and, invading other countries. It's always been like that. So it's a paradox that objectively and not so much that our modern concept of tolerance was born in fact in the 17th century. So when at the end of a period of terrible confessional clashes, after which Europe was literally destroyed, especially in terms of moral resources. So we're saying, let's stop this madness and let's stop with this bloodbath, and let's conceive a political theory that can accept the fact that there are people of different faiths, really better confessions, living together and being granted a right to do so. And that's also on how our Western society is based on, and obviously we're thankful about it. But if you look at the Middle Ages, you realize that in spite of the intolerance that existed, there was a sort of greater dialogue, a greater impact of different ideas of people were coming, and people were opened to other cultures, to other civilizations. This is very important. You see how much the Europeans were interested into Muslim culture at the time. All the translations that they did from Arab texts that of course were of Hellenic origins, but were that was not even important because they were anxious to get the contents of those. And they learned Arab just to be able to translate it. This is something amazing. Who does it today? Conceptually. The only idea of looking at this other world is something weird, something controversial, something political, but at that time it wasn't. You needed those informations. You wanted to know more. You knew that there was a book over there. You went literally into the Muslim world. You go take that together with other things, because you work with that place. You trade with that place. You exchange with that place. There is no just warfare. Warfare is always something episodic. Also because there weren't enough resources to fight all the time. Um, and you change. You draw a lot of resources. You draw a lot of knowledge. We wouldn't have had. I made so many videos about this. Just think about how this context has been instrumental to develop scholastics in the Christian world. If it hadn't been for Thomas Aquinas studying Aristotle from the Arab authors, or there could have had been the history of the church would have been completely different. So, and at the time, these people were aware of it. This is interesting. It's not something passive. I also hate it sometimes how the exchange, the arrival of these manuscripts from the East. It was first of all not really an arrival, because it was the same Western Europeans would went there, seized them. Secondly, I hate how passively it's told, as if Western Europe was like a dark hole that needed a manuscript to wake up once again. It wasn't like that. They had already woken up. They had never fallen asleep. They got taken that themselves. These were the Middle Ages, a moment in which people were anxious of knowledge. Always remember, the Middle Ages, yes, the Middle Ages, not the Enlightenment, was the time of greatest thirst of knowledge in the whole human history. Because in the time of the Enlightenment, the main interest was to find new categories of knowledge. Then filling them was another passage. The medieval man, without any category, without or very few of them, didn't care. Just went for it. Just went learning. Books have never had so much cost like in the Middle Ages. Never. Knowledge was given at that point a huge value. There's never been a time in history in which knowledge has ever had a greater value like the Middle Ages. You will argue, yeah, okay, because it was rarer. Yes, but that's what makes people wanting to learn that. And not like today, that we're a bunch of scum that has the whole knowledge a click away and doesn't even bother to learn it. Doesn't ever bother itself to learn it. Because that's what we are. Just to think about those people back in the day who could make thousands of kilometers of travel just for taking one book. Would you be willing to do it? Don't you feel ashamed of yourself? I do. And those people did it. Not all of them, of course, but there were people who would do it. Would risk their lives even for taking a manuscript. And it was considered a blessing. It was really not even about the action. It was also considering what was knowledge conceived like. Because it's not definitely the same way we look at it today. This is my rant that we have to go on. So, there have been people who have said the Middle Ages have been the age of experimentation. That is, of research in every field, in every direction, and research for several different solutions that are inherent to the problems of existence, of civil coexistence. And people have said, essentially, was there anything unitary into this? I mean, was there a group, an entity that has tried to systematize everything? Well, objectively, yes. You can find this in the church. Ecclesiology and religious tensions have probably represented during the Middle Ages these actors that had an awareness of the system, practically. They were conscious about having to deal with a wall. Mm. These weren't the only ones, because this was a universal system, and you can find this also in the empire. Excuse me. And the concept that there has been a large container, essentially, into which the whole humanity has to live. This is something that also we have lost. We complain about how fragmented the Middle Ages were, for instance, politically speaking, so we see our world as so unitary, but in the Middle Ages there was something so unitary that we don't have it anymore today. That is the concept of universalism, the concept that has to be one single state all over the world, one single church all over the world. Those people were thinking it. Today we don't think it anymore. We all are interested about our tiny, miserable individual interests, and we don't care about the system. So we are much more stupid, actually, than those people were under this point of view. There is, however, this was kind of the exception. The church naturally had, with this, chiefly the church, because also the empire was limited in part. The church had a greater view on this sense. However, there were so many other branches, brooklets, if you want, of that looked that comprehended this cosmos, that were comprehended in this cosmos of the Middle Ages, that had that saw the strengthening of autonomous orientations on every point of view, in the economical field, in political affirmation, intellectual curiosity, aesthetical sensibility, that were felt deeply from the within as a willing process. There were so many individuals, groups, or even classes that were in different ways and in different measure somewhat either extraneous or rebellious to the official system. Mm. And this is very important to conceive, because that idea of universalism actually permeated everybody. During the Middle Ages, if you had asked to the average medieval in Europe, where they were living, they would answer you: we are living essentially into the age of Christ, and and physically into the Roman Empire. Medievals thought like this. They felt they were, there is an emperor, that's the Roman Emperor, and just like in antiquity, we're living into it. The age is the age of Christ. We count our years on that basis. Those were those horizons. So everybody kind of had this universalistically minded conception of the world. But nevertheless, within this world, still there were so many groups, so many individuals who acted autonomously. And the confidence of this autonomy was given exactly by this sense of absolute that permeated their mind. It's paradoxical, because if you are already framed into a container, you don't care about being autonomous so much. You like to be concentrated about this container. It's just like with nationalism today. You say, where am I born? In this country, okay, so I'm gonna be a nationalist for it because I want to be characterized in that way, and you stick to it. At the time, if you have a world that is all not flat, because you understand it's not, and by the way, let's not think the medievals thought the world was flat, because that's also another myth. They knew that the earth was round, but aside from that, the point I was making is that when you have these broad containers like the universe, etc., you immediately feel important, you immediately feel empowered, you immediately feel that that universe is being created for you, and you want to explore it, you want to know it. When we have lost universalism, we have lost this. We have perhaps there's been, especially during modern age, a moment of great push towards what was new, but this was coming in fact as a momentum from the medieval times that were certain options were confined to that system. Now, knowing that that system didn't work quite anymore, it was a great astonishment. It was actually a very dramatic moment, as we were saying before. Also, the discovery in the New World was something incredible, because medievals up to that point had thought that the world was essentially the one they had represented to their stylized um, ways, very symbolically speaking. Now they found out there was another world. Just think about the cultural shock that existed at this point. So that gave them a bit more of a need, when instability also brings to this autonomous, strengthening of autonomous initiative, but universalism does as well. So we have the paradox of a world that is capable of thinking itself as a whole, as such, but also that gives autonomy to the single individuals. Is this the world we live in today? Doesn't seem like that. Of course, by approximation, you can say by a certain degree. There is also this thing, of course, but it's not really the leading factor. Today we stick to our own tiny things. Where you come from, where, more or less what your life is, that's it. Not that medievals were that different either, indeed, but today people do not pose questions like, how should we rule our world altogether? We most likely see enemies all around, and we just are concerned about doing well in our community, in our country, in our culture, and that's it. In those times, everything was acceptable in practice. Everybody could fit into this. They solved problems very easily. For instance, from the Christian point of view, the Muslims in the Middle Ages were essentially Christian heretics, because they thought that Muhammad had been a schismatic bishop. So this is all much more comforting, because implicitly it meant that at a certain point these heretics would have been, wiped out, or that, however, they were just an anomaly within a Christian, universal world. So it's kind of, they were looking, obviously, with all its their limits, but they were, however, confident about that this world could work all together in some way. Today we've lost it. Today we basically gave up at thinking that we can make everybody go towards a unique direction, because the only option for doing that would be unleashing World War III and practicing to destroy our world in a nuclear holocaust. That's the only way you could see it done, and we feel very much our tensions, our clashes, or our religious clashes as such, rather than more complex phenomena that have to be analyzed. Say in every given one by one individually, in order to solve them effectively. We prefer to consider the world as divided, and this doesn't get just for religion, this also get for politics and so on. So it's normal, actually. I'm not saying it's something relatively negative. It's just, I'm just making reflect on how the different perception that we have from the medievals in many ways. And medievals definitely also felt divided. They obviously recognized that there were divisions, but these divisions were all conceived as, in fact, a degeneration of a unitary system. Today that unity is lacking in our world as such, or is being, I think, stressed or pushed, emphasized by people who have a very utopistic view of the world, that is also very much politically oriented. I mean, it does have a color in terms of of ideologies and so on. In the Middle Ages, this was the Great Zero. It was very, very important, because ultimately it had to do also with the individual choices. And it's obvious that if you live in a world that has a very few certainties, you're always trying to seize to secure what seems to be the central starting point, if you want. So let's see what we can say now. Oh, and history, and this is also important, especially about the Middle Ages, were for other times in history naturally, but it's the idea that we never have to forget the defeated, in my opinion. There is a certain rhetoric relatively to the idea that the defeated are always kind of, you know, the forgotten heroes of history that the evil winner has basically demonized and of whom the memory has been erased, because only winners write history. This is not really true. But nevertheless, it's difficult, especially in times like the Middle Ages, to study in depth everything. Certain movements that, especially the ones that have been indeed wiped out, you can't see it because we don't know. How much do we know about the Cathars, for instance? Objectively, we know almost nothing about the Cathars, and the most recent historiography basically is all kind of agrees in saying, well, these probably weren't the heretics that the church has depicted, because at that point it was a very strong political interest for the Church of Rome, the Kingdom of France, to wipe out these autonomous political entities of southern France, to basically extend their power in there. And we are sure that something was happening there, religiously speaking, but we can't really focus on what it was. And as far as we can see, we realize that probably also most of what was happening was not so devious or heterodox or heretical, even as it is the justification for the Albigensian Crusade would let us suggest. But this is just, for example, from a religious point of view. About the evangelic papistical movements, there were a huge movement into the High Middle Ages, and about which we don't know essentially a big much, because they kind of vanished, they were absorbed. Indeed, I'm not a great, I made lots of videos on evangelic papistical movements, but in this sense, I don't want you to think that when I'm discussing this, I'm saying I'm making victimism for them, because it's all, sure, many people have been slaughtered, there have been wars, there have been persecutions, so on, but this was really from both sides in many ways. So I'm not making this also neither relativism, because I always, if you follow my videos regularly, you know that I kind of speak quite straightforwardly for the, the accountability of everybody practically. So I don't care. But just for, I would like to leave you mostly with the historical problem that this poses. I mean, how much do we know about all those experiences that have been ultimately forgotten? Because not enough has arrived to us about them. I made a video, for instance, and this goes also from a socio-economical point of view. For instance, some time ago I made a video that is called Late Medieval Peasants' Revolts, a Decisive and Lost Battle. That is also a very interesting point, I think, in history that I thought to dedicate a video to, because for many reasons, actually, and if you wait, I drink a little and explain it why. Because this breaks also a bit of stereotypes about the myths about the medieval peasantry. Because medieval peasantry is also in this dark picture of the Middle Ages is conceived as a sort of, they were just serfs/slaves, and that always plowed the land and so on. This is not how really it was. I mean, obviously, this is true for also not really even most of the medieval peasants, but say in general, their living conditions were pretty harsh. But that's because living conditions were pretty harsh almost for almost everybody at the time, and the only way to survive was to work like that, so independently from someone obliging you to do it. But it's mostly from the late Middle Ages and actually into the modern age that the situation, the condition of peasants actually worsens dramatically, and that's what I when I explained in that video. So that if you look at medieval peasants, especially during early medieval and high medieval times, they weren't so, they were actually pretty dynamic individuals. Also, their communities were pretty strong and aggressive, and they participated to the political debate and so on. And basically, they lost it. I mean, towards the end of the Middle Ages, especially 14th to 15th century, the peasant revolts could bring to certain different outcomes. In the French states, you could have seen into the modern age the peasants being represented, but this failed. This failed for many reasons, because chiefly because they weren't coordinated, they were ignorant, they didn't have this autonomous conscience more than else. There were these extremely violent outbreaks of peasant revolts during the Middle Ages. Think about the Jacquerie in France, or that were extremely violent. They killed a lot of people, but they hadn't a common organization. It had a common guide. They hadn't someone who could speak for them. Also, ignorance paid in this sense. It didn't. I mean, made them pay. And what we do know about peasants? What do we know about them? We don't know almost nothing, because peasants didn't leave us much. They didn't write. They didn't read. Not at least not all of them. There were certain places where peasants were also decently educated into the Middle Ages, and this should also be brought. But generally speaking, we know a very few about the peasant world. We know essentially about during Middle Ages. We know the most about usually the feudal hierarchies and the city republics, because those were the only ones who produced something concrete. Also very ideological, especially in the feudal world, a bit more realistic in the communal civilization, but that's it. The vast majority of the population in the Middle Ages were peasants, and definitely they left a very tiny bit of sources to us, unfortunately. So even knowing what was in the mindset of a medieval peasant would be amazing to scope. Unfortunately, we can't really much, because they didn't leave us the opportunity to do it, unfortunately. So we don't have to forget also what history leaves out, and not because there is one evil guy that wants to erase the memory of or to distort history, like also these conspiracy theories are, but it's simply because we lack the sources. And of course, the ones we have are usually ideologically oriented. Also, the Middle Ages weren't a moment of free thinking, because everybody essentially wrote for some politically oriented reasons. But who doesn't? Who didn't in history? Because objectively, everybody has a subjective opinion. Sometimes in the Middle Ages, we see a much greater. It's not really about the telling the truth most of the times. It's really about trying to understand why that person wants to say a certain thing. And so medievals, and also this goes for these sources, the interpretation of medieval sources, you never have to read them as if, look at these guys, we're saying blatant lies. You have to understand why we're saying that, why we're saying certain things. Propaganda was extremely important to the Middle Ages. It was an important theoretical tool. During my master thesis, I was reading a letter that was written by a king just before a battle, that was commenting on the enemy army. And I read this, and I said, the first thing I said is this guy is nuts, essentially, because he was saying completely false things. It was essentially saying that the enemy army was weak, that they didn't have any help, that reinforcements for his own army were arriving. And I knew from the other sources that this was not true, and I said, but why is this person lying? Why is he writing this thing? And then I discovered that this king had written this letter because he wanted to boost the morale of his own army just before the battle, because the situation was so desperate that he had to do it for the morale of his own men. So that's when you understand, that's like that, and you can't judge him, because the first thing is like saying, we are so obsessed with the truth, with facts, as those positivistic scholars left us with, that we can't even, we lost criticism. The Middle Ages were a moment of great criticism, of people who didn't have to necessarily reach the truth because through certainty, because that was not a word of certainty. They could reach certainty only through criticism, only through getting into things and observing them from a perspective that ultimately they had to create by their own, on their own, because they didn't have no fixed point to stay in. Just imagine what it meant even just to live in a world that doesn't know physics, at least modern physics. It's a completely different approach to reality. So you can't study medieval history without bearing these things in mind all the time, because otherwise you fall into those same mistakes that the everybody would criticize negatively or even positively the Middle Ages, so that didn't remain neutral, didn't remain objective as much as they could, by the way, did. It's this idea of giving the Middle Ages a somewhat a, these guys were not like us. Of course they were not like us. I mean, in part they were like us because we are all the same as human beings, but it's obvious that the moment had been different from your own. What do you study history for? For just mirroring yourself and saying, oh, that guy looks ugly because I look better because I'm me, and the other is different, so it's bad. And that's stupid. That's not history. That's your idiocy mixed with narcissism. I don't know what. Yeah. There's speaking of sources, that we touched now as a history, as we know, it's based on sources, so it's based on such contents practically. So a great problem that we still have in our medieval studies today is that for other reasons I don't want to make to stop on, because they can grow very polemical how the academic world works and so on. But potentially is that the contemporary medievistics has exploded basically in a huge mass of say a multiplicity of different directions, we can say. So there is this increasing refusal to, and a pretty generalized refusal at this point, to reflect theoretically on the identity and on the sense of the Middle Ages as a whole. This is very difficult because indeed today we see a lot of interdisciplinary activity as well. History at this today cannot be studied without sociology, without anthropology. But the problem is that essentially because historiography has become increasingly more refined, increasingly more sophisticated, many people have said, we can't. I mean, instinctively, it was not even probably rationalized. It's something that happened just for sheer pragmatism, that we can't look at the Middle Ages as a whole because it doesn't make sense. And this is kind of, it has its pros and cons, definitely. But because it's positive, because that leads also to a sort of hyper specialization, so we can know better about the details. But at the same time, we are lacking a vision of ensemble. And this is a pity, because it's important to reflect also on the same concept of the Middle Ages, paradoxically to break it down, but still to see that objectively there were certain systemic elements. This is a bit also the problem of learning medieval history, that I was talking to you about before. It's very easy to learn, the story of a single country during the Middle Ages. You can say, it's not necessarily easy, but it's something you can do because it's conceptually easy to picture you in mind that thing. The problem is when you start understanding that this world, as fragmented as it could be, it was already interconnected in an incredible way. Perhaps the greatest myth of the Middle Ages is people traveled a few, or that on average this is true, but that this world was not connected is complete idiocy. There were transcontinental traffics all the time during the Middle Ages. There were people coming from everywhere, and especially all this fragmentation unavoidably brought to a lot of influences coming from everywhere. We've seen this paradox of a politically fragmented world that still recognized an imperial power and a papal power, for instance, that effectively had an influence, that effectively ruled in some measure, obviously not fully in a fully functional way, but if you take the influence of certain powers in the world, this goes as well with the concept of centralization and decentralization. We need to think that feudal Europe was all decentralized. The kingdoms were practically all fragmented just because they were institutionally feudal. But this is not true, because these kingdoms were capable also of moving as one. So feudalism, in part, is a paradox because it was based on a decentralization, political practice and administrative practice, but it was still a gluing factor. I mean, how can you understand the history of the Middle Ages, for instance, if you don't understand how influent was the pulverization of political power after the Carolingian Empire to paradoxically create an identity? By the 12th century, basically every Western European had this idea that he was living in a feudal world, that he saw the same political practices, the same, knights were all the same. They think that there was a unity. Seigneurial culture recognized itself wherever you came from. There was a respect also. There was an affinity that was because even though that was all fragmented, it was recognized of stemming from the same place. This is not indifferent as a concept, and so we don't need to think the Middle Ages as a unique thing, but we can because it's a mistake that is also inherent to the same concept of Middle Ages as we've seen historiographically speaking. But at the same time, we don't have to forget into this extremely complex system that there were certain variables, certain factors that were pretty much they were influencing the whole system. So you can't necessarily sectorialize all this world, just saying I choose this tiny bit and I don't think about the whole, because you can't understand even that tiny bit if you don't look at the whole system. And it's a shame because so many publications you see about the Middle Ages, they're so tiny in terms of scope, of range. And according to me, this is impoverishing the view we are having about the whole period. And I personally, the more I study the Middle Ages, the more I like instead to stress this overall, to treat it as a whole system, more than saying, okay, it was evidently all alike. But there were still so many things that crossed it, so many phenomena that crossed it, they're pretty similar. And we're essentially talking about a similar world, because if you look at the structure of the essentials, this was a pre-industrial society. It's not that there could be so many differences. So we don't have to be tricked by this provincialism, this fragmentation, as if that was all what the Middle Ages were, because it wasn't anything like that. And I suspect, and I firmly believe, that the medieval man believed in this, believed in the fact of the universalism as something realistic, as something concrete, as something that informed is her own life every day. In spite of all the interests that exist, and also in here there is a huge debate, because many people, especially from the French historiography has stressed very much this idea of universalism, because the French monarchy had this enormous also ideological great development in political theory that entailed also very much the religion as a driving factor. Many other historians have kind of criticized this by saying that, after all, the Middle Ages was much more secular than we imagine. I have some doubts about this, because these are naturally two extremes, but in fact this is the point I'm making, is it's as if these two things were coexisting at all time. And this, in my opinion, also answers, the achievements of the Middle Ages, because a civilization that is capable of conceiving both the universal and the mostly, local and contingent, is a great civilization. It's like when you read Dante's Commedia. You see a world that is capable of conceiving the lowest, most disgusting, even vulgar, and trivial and earthly concept, that can think also of the perfection, of the purity, of the most highly spiritual and greater perfection of the heavens. This is what the medievals were able to range from. They looked at the spectrum of the world and said, we have to know it, we have to investigate it, we have to understand it. And everything was together with science. This is also another point. In the Middle Ages, religion and science went in pair. And today, many people, not all of them, indeed think that, for instance, religion and science are kind of oppositive. They're kind of two separated, oppositive systems of interpretation of the world. Well, look at the Middle Ages, and look at how people were curious about science, because ultimately what makes science great is the eternal ability to put everything into discussion. If you lose that, science is over. True science is over. There are many people who would like science to be fixed to, certain dogmatic doctrine. I mean, they exchange it for a different religion, practically. The science is not like that. And the medievals knew it. Being religious people, they perfectly knew how to use science as well. And this is amazing. And it's a very difficult thing to find in other ages, with the same, the same presence of spiritual tension and of scientific curiosity. This is a great element of the Middle Ages, that a great characteristics of the Middle Ages never has to be forgotten. Another great problem is the given the immense quantity of knowledge we have about the Middle Ages, another great problem, always relative to the context, is not just to periodize the Middle Ages as a whole, but also scanning it. So making smaller periodizations within it. So also in here, historiographies have produced very different systems to frame the medieval contents. Generally speaking, I think the major... Now I'm going to make a bit of an international survey, let's say. Generally speaking, the Middle Ages is split in two. Ideally from before and after the year 1000. So saying early and low, or high or low Middle Ages. Also in here, in fact, it changes, because in French it's usually haut et basse Moyen Âge. In English is usually early and late Middle Ages. In German is frühes and spätes Mittelalter. And yeah, that's mostly the division. The first chunk is between the 5th and the 10th century, and the second one is between the 11th and the 15th. So this is more or less the watershed. In German historiography, at a certain point it came out this concept of Hoch Mittelalter, that you find also, and I use pretty much also in English, the High Middle Ages. That is it's very interesting, and I like it very much because it basically corresponds to the so-called central centuries of the Middle Ages. That is roughly between the 10th and the 13th century. In my opinion, are some of the most beautiful centuries of the Middle Age. Well, okay, the Middle Ages are all beautiful, but um, that's a very important point I liked, especially to discuss also a lot on Schwerpunkt. And this concept of high Middle Ages is also very interesting because it doesn't really have just a mere temporal meaning. It's not just something that stays into the middle temporally, but it's as if it was referring to the parabola of medieval civilization as such. So the superior section of a curve that is rising, and that eventually it falls, into which medieval civilization basically appears in itself as a as an accomplished system in that it's especially given with very uh, very specific and original characters that make it distinguishable from all the others. In Italian, this chronological segment is sometimes called pieno medioevo or medioevo centrale. So that is basically full Middle Ages or central Middle Ages. So also in here there's a bit of a semantic differentiation, but the concept mostly is the same. And really every country, remember always this, every country has a different view of history. As any language has a different meaning practically. You can't translate properly these terms in all their various colors. Say, okay, these are equivalent. Yeah, they're mostly similar, but every state, every people has kind of looked at its own history in different ways. So these names are loaded, each one with their own meanings in practice. There are also other even more punctilious, not really punctilious, but more specific terms that want to get it more precise. For instance, there is also this idea of the first Middle Ages, that also would be the early medieval times, that someone also blurs and overlaps with the late antiquity in practice, because to many, there are people, I personally like to stress the idea that the Middle Ages began later than we usually think. I think the Middle Ages started roughly in the 6th century, not in the 5th. Depending on, because every place had kind of its own history, but there were many people who said, well, you know what, the Middle Ages began kind of at the time of Diocletian and Constantine in the essentials. I don't like it much as a concept, but I kind of understand it. It kind of makes sense also sometimes. The point is obviously just a matter of arbitrary opinion. Also in here we are always thinking that these periodizations are affected also by a certain because there are things in the true history we basically see and we perceive in a way that was not necessarily what it was perceived at the time. Because every time in history has tried to portray itself, and certain times were naturally influenced by so many different ideas and thoughts that it looks as if they were so radically different from one another, but objectively there wasn't such a huge difference in great times, and especially before the Industrial Revolution. I mean, history has been relatively, comparable in many ways, at least from the times of the I don't even know where to start talking about it, because you can't say that, I don't know. Doesn't matter really, but especially talking about from classical times proper, this from classical Greece into onwards. It's not that society was enormously different. There were substantial difference, enormous if you want. Enormous is a relative adjective. Obviously, you can use it as you like, but there were certain bases were kind of the same. So when we do these periodizations, we essentially look at mostly what was left in as an epiphenomenon. Sometimes even through things that were so extraordinary, like monuments, art. So not necessarily what was the real life, about which unfortunately we don't know that much. Or what was the real feeling? Because just imagine now, if you ask anyone in your life, your family, your friends, whatever, you ask them to describe our own world today, our own phase, this phase of history. You realize that they will all give a kind of different. I mean, there still be some similar idea, also because you all belong to this time. But it's varying wildly, objectively. Everybody's gonna stress a different aspect of this time. So this is also what we have to bear in mind when we look at the past and look at the sources and what is left to us. This is just being done by someone who had some idea in mind. What about those people who didn't leave anything to us? What will we know? Naturally, history is a bit more complex in the sense that we can scope a little bit. Thankfully, we live now in a time into which historiography is refined enough to point so many interesting things out that can help us understand also relatively about things we don't know excessively much about. Thanks especially to interdisciplinary, I don't know how to say that, to interdisciplinary approach and so on. But still we don't have to be tricked, to be fooled by, I don't know, an ideological propaganda, for instance. Because it's obvious that you're going to consider differently the world of Constantine from the world of Justinian, because there were two different worlds, but these two people also portrayed themselves in two different ways that in this sense can be not just undetached one from another, something was in common naturally as well, but that were also relatively detached from the reality that maybe was more similar than we can imagine by certain standards. So this goes also for the end of the Middle Ages, like the last or late Middle Ages. Which one is it? Normally it starts from the crisis of the mid 14th century, with the economical collapse, with the Black Death. That objectively has been very important. That's for instance a watershed that because objectively the plague made a hell of a mess there in a very few years in Europe. But also there had been previous economical cracks and so on. So that's an important watershed that people usually don't think much about. They like to stress more the continuity. I personally, now maybe this is just my impression at this time and age I have, I don't know, but it seems to me that that mid 14th century has been a very big watershed, and maybe we'll concentrate on this more specifically also on another occasion. So, as you understand, this time scanning is completely abstract. So it's always necessary you can solve this problem also by increasing the scanning. I mean, getting deeper, you can make, how often, for instance, we talk about a specific century. We say, that century as if that century was a thing on its own. But how realistic is that? It's obvious that, I don't know, the 18th century never existed. I don't know why I have to pick the 18th century, but it's like a very iconic century, even regarding certain, I don't know, aspects, even more frivolous kind of stuff, like just the appearance, like fashion, art, and that's something that wildly, even through the through the cinema, for instance, affects us. We get a stereotype view of the 18th century, and because they looked in a certain context that eventually you discover to be very peculiar, maybe of a certain decade more than another, in a certain way. And in fact, you always need to make this, but they don't exist. You can also stay anchored to a decade, even to a single year, or maybe in absolute terms to a single day. Uh, just think about how important is July the 14th, 1789. That is a purely conventional day, but everything thinks. I mean, 1792 was a much more important time for the developments of history, but we still remember that specific day of the capture of the Bastille. Why? Because someone decided it. It's actually arbitrary. Um, and also, there is another problem with periodization that is strictly thematic, because history is not an homogeneous thing. Do you remember the metaphor I made at the beginning of the video with this stream with all the various currents within it? So what is that you really want to look at in history? Because that can vary widely, and periodizations can vary widely on the base of that. You can look at history from a cultural, an economical, a political, a social point of view, so that sometimes it happens also among historians that you are expert of a certain field, in a certain field, and you start using certain periodizations or names of certain phases, and the other person was not much into your specific field, maybe even if he's or she's studying the same period, maybe, but from another point of view, they don't know what to say, because it's as if it was new to them. So just to make you understand how it can vary so much. So perspective can vary really considerably, and in this sense, history is not a compact thing. It's not something you can say, okay, this is as if it was a substance, an homogeneous material. No, it always changes. And there are, by the way, also other. This is important because not only history changes at different paces, so that indeed, and this is also my personal, very subjective and personal view of history, is that I think that history moves as a sort of impulses. And it really never stops, but it's as if there were moments in which there are certain leaps forward or backwards. It depends also in here. What does it mean? Forwards or backwards? It's a very teleological statement as well. But as it's been pointed out, even by a great French historian like Fernand Braudel, there are different times for different phenomena. For instance, politics is very speedy, usually. Politics makes things vary wildly. In our world today, usually strategical analysis are not done realistically more than 3 months term, because things could really vary so much. Politics is always constantly changing, constantly. Economy, excuse me, economy has definitely longer rhythms, as it's often associated also to more structural factors, so that you have this kind of physical attrition, so that the world cannot change economically from extremely speedily. At least it compared to politics, that's much slower. And also sometimes, and this is paradoxical, also the daily life of people kind of changes even more slowly. People tend to realize, you realize this, that the human mind in general tends to settle on certain things. There is this hand of history illusion that is essentially the idea you don't think things are gonna change, because we are programmed. Our software is programmed to to say, okay, now I settle on this track and it will go on kind of forever, hopefully. Things can change, but you always underestimate how much and how fast they can change. So sometimes even an economical cycle that is something relatively long, even assuming there are cycles, but at least certain phenomena, economical dynamics, can change faster than you realize. And this doesn't mean that you do not adapt to them, but still you tend to remain on your tracks, and there is this kind of gap consistently between what we realize and how things change. And it's a cognitive condition. If anything, because before realizing that something happened, time lapses. Because our cognitive means are kind of slow. So, if you see an explosion, before you realize it already happened. So you have to deal afterwards with that. So we constantly live always kind of keeping up with the pace of history, if you want. And it's difficult because just in human mind gets molded by such also by certain events. I mean, if you talk with people from of different generations, you realize they all kind of live in their own time still, when they were young, practically. If you talk with your parents, your grandparents, you notice that they have still, it's as if they were still back at that time for many ways. And there are times when they were young, when they had formed their own opinions, their own world, and it's more difficult for them to change or to think them. And the same thing you can see it now. I'm speaking with a relatively as a relatively young person. I can see it with youngers, with people who were younger than me. If I talk to them, I realize I'm already built, I'm already structured. They are still forming instead. They're still developing in a way that eventually will not be able to be, because they received other inputs. They received other influences. And this happens all the time, because there are also biological standards that definitely are always the same. I mean, in the last millennia, our genetic material has not really changed much. If you talk about medievals, they're essentially the same identical people we are today from a biological point of view. So it's also very fascinating to realize how much the context can influence essentially an art. People were essentially the same, and how much we can change, and how malleable we are, and how we underestimate our malleability. There are other very fascinating theories, like the ones of Jacques Le Goff. I'm very sympathetic with, because they and actually even extremize a little bit, because from an anthropological and economical and socio-economical point of view, there is this idea of long Middle Ages. Le Goff came out with this, the idea of a long Middle Ages that basically lasted, according to him, if I'm not wrong, it was up to the practically up to the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution. I tend to see it in a very much more instead political way. I think that the Middle Ages can be seen in this long-range perspective to have ended actually with World War the First, with the fall of Austria-Hungary, the Second German Empire, and the Tsarist Russia. I believe that's the Middle Ages that finished, and that's so. I mean, as an ancien regime, and I like to stress that. Even from a military point of view, if you ask me, when is that the military Middle Ages really ended? I think I would tell you, 1917, 1918. That's it. But naturally, this is also debatable, and it's not an absolute, but it's a perspective, and because this is the point, we use the approximations also to give food for thought to other people, and let them think, and to be more dynamic, to be more critical. And this is naturally this is a structuralist. I mean, this the one from Lagov is a kind of structuralist vision in the sense that even Marx had sense essentially this. I mean, the idea that the Middle Ages is a feudal, is mostly what feudal system is, so the Ancien Regime. But even before Marx, Voltaire had said something similar. All from different points of view, because Marx was doing it from a communist perspective, Voltaire was doing it from an enlightened perspective. So but it's been there are many different authors that have kind of come up with this. So another, I think, self-evident thing that to me I use it even to mock a bit my modern my modernist colleagues is to say that basically the Middle Ages lasted throughout the whole modern age. And modernists, I've been having a lot of debates with them because they want to instead to stress really the difference from, that as if, with modern age something radically different change, and I think it's such a bad and actually false and perception that still resents so much of enlightenment and of also of humanism, but also of positivism. I mean, the idea that modern Europe changed, everything was different. It was not anymore like the Middle Ages. As a matter of fact, most of modern age was like the Middle Ages in the essentials. Firearms didn't change a big deal. They really had an extremely slow pace. There were also, the colonialism expanded very progressively. So actually the essentials of before the Industrial Revolution, especially the essentials of especially low medieval and early modern society were not that late medieval, early modern society were not that different substantially. And also, the more I read about modern age, the more I realize that there was such a great continuity also in the perception of this. I mean, the modern age was thinking itself still in many ways that were proper of the universalism of the Middle Ages. Yeah, the mindset was changing. I'm not saying that the Renaissance didn't bring to another form of another view of the world and so on, but in many ways this was still very conservative. And it would be interesting also to deepen this other topic, but we can't. And also a very convenient excuse not to provide further explanation. No, I promise I will. I will comment this in some time. So, as you understand, this is a completely different perspective from those positivists, from the one of those positivists who said that basically the dark ages, dark, lasted between essentially the fifth and therefore the Middle Ages between the 5th and 10th century. There are people who have gone also the opposite direction. For instance, Guy Bois states, came up with this idea that the Middle Ages began more or less towards the year 1000. It's also very interesting because it stresses the continuity between the ancient world and the and early medieval times. This is also very fascinating because if you look at indeed, and this is a parallelism I like to draw also in terms of the idea of the imperial dignity that is discussed recently, the age of Charlemagne. I mean, if you take the Renovatio Imperii, for instance, of the Roman Empire in the West, and later the Holy Roman Empire, you realize, Charlemagne was essentially living only 3 centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It's not really much. So there was a mindset that stemmed. Even if you take, the Romantic art, or it's difficult to see such a brutal end of the also late antiquity as whatever, because late antiquity is a very specific topic. Doesn't very specific term. It doesn't help you that much. But if you take that away, if you see this continuum of the ancient world kind of transforming, you realize during the Middle Ages there were so many aspects of continuity. I realized this because I kind of like the early medieval times and discuss them pretty extensively at this point on Schwerpunkt. And sometimes I like to stress big, say changes that the more you get, the closer you get to that specific point in history, and the bigger they seem. Instead, if you know, look at the long range or the broader perspective, you see that maybe they weren't very substantial. This is a kind of an optic effect that happens all the times, really. So it's easy, especially when discussing these maximal systems and these broader temporal perspectives, to, in fact, indulge into approximations. This is the point, because the deeper you go into history, the more you say, "Oh, everything changed. It was so different." Then you look at from the above and say, "Well, maybe not so much." So it really depends. There is a lot of relativism attached also to these topics, and that's why ultimately they're so arbitrary in many ways, and they're meaningless in the achievements, but in terms of, because you can't get to a real conclusion, but they're so helpful because they teach you how to look at certain things and to refine your criticism, your perception, your sensitivity. Another very important element of the Middle Ages is the geographical one. I mean, the Middle Ages, I talk, for instance, on Schwerpunkt, is a eminently European Middle Ages. It's obvious. This also stems from historical reasons, chiefly the fact that the Europeans at a certain point began to be the most advanced. I mean, the Europeans and their affiliations around the world, like in North America and so on, to be kind of the most advanced countries in the world, and they begin to write their own history, concentrating on themselves. Everybody does it, so it's not really but it's that the Western society, in this sense, thought of themselves, I don't know how to say this, kind of organized its own history in a much more solid way than, I personally, I don't know whether it's because so Western-centric myself sometimes, but also in terms of historiography, I don't know anything about, say, Chinese historiography or Indian historiography. I've never read anything from that. I mean, I've read authors that were coming from that cultural background, but into the Western society. So that you find many people, I've read many books, I don't know, about medieval Islam, stuff like that, were written by people with of Islamic, I don't know, background, tradition, whatever, that they wrote for, I don't know, the Cambridge Press or something like that. So because they know more, but they still talk to essentially a Western audience, into a Western academy and so on. And I believe this is actually factual. I mean, the Westerners are at this point the ones who have written more about their own history, and naturally the Middle Ages being so important for us as being also this great matter of debate. On Schwerpunkt, really, I tend to extend not just to make a European perspective, but also a Mediterranean and a Near and Middle Eastern perspective as well, because I think that you can't understand the European Middle Ages if you don't understand those topics as well. Another thing I do very happily is to try to give a bit more of attention to Eastern Europe, although I don't know excessively much about it, but I realize it's like a big gap. I mean, historiographically speaking, we realized that, I don't know, we forgot about the Byzantines, for instance, and we even called them in this way. And now there is, I think, a decent, although maybe, still a bit of sceptic historiography on Byzantium, on the Roman Empire during the medieval times. But nobody has bothered itself to talk about Eastern Europe more in detail and to acknowledge how big that chunk of medieval history is and how much is neglected, especially from our own Western perspective. So it is true that also at that time Eastern Europe produced less in terms of sources than Western Europe. So it's pretty obvious that people study things like Italy or France or Spain or Germany, England, and so on. But it's yeah, that's also a world that wasn't, after all, that different from the Western one, and that we kind of neglected. Why? Well, because I don't know. When I was born, it was still the Soviet Union. The Cold War was a fresh memory, so we felt the need to kind of differentiate, and naturally, the Eastern Europeans lived into a world at this point that still resents of that experience. So even in terms of historiographical development and so on, they are very different worlds from the West still. But now everything is kind of getting more homogeneous progressively, but the differences are still felt. So I think that this is actually a very big problem, especially that the European. I believe that there will be a common European education at one point. The European Union is not moving in any way towards this direction. We have to need to find for the Middle Ages that are this, mostly European thing, and obviously it belongs to any other one that interacted or derived from Europe, in that that also whose ancestors were in Europe at that time. Um, we should find a way to tell our own history, not from a national perspective, from a European perspective, because um, it's a matter of seeing us together as a driving force, actually, and we can't still stick to, that's my tiny world, because I've seen actually lots of people actually all over Europe that still believe my Middle Ages, as if you can't talk about the Middle Ages of a single nation. It doesn't make sense. This is 19th century talk. It's anti-historical for the Middle Ages. You can surely identify certain proto-national identities and so on, but this doesn't mean that that's all about that. You can't stay focused only on those borders, because it wasn't like that at the time, and it hasn't arguably never been. Um, so um, there are so also many Middle Ages in this sense, because not just from a geographical point of view, you can say the European Middle Ages. You can say things like the Middle Ages of the communes, for instance, because if you take the communal age, communal civilization, that's been actually quite big thing. This is eventually the one, um, um, but it has more sense for a country like Italy than others. It's obvious, but at the same time, it's paradox, because many people see the beginning of the modern age exactly through, in Italy, through humanism and the Renaissance. So where does the one end and the other begin? Because it's complicated to say. For other countries, if you take Spain, for instance, in Spain there is this brutal 1492 that marked definitely into the Iberian Peninsula the end of an epoch, with the expulsions of the Jews, the conquest of the last Islamic kingdom, and naturally also the travel of the Atlantic journey of Christopher Columbus. So that's a powerful year, for instance, but it's obviously much more loaded from an Iberian perspective than from, say, I don't know, a Polish perspective. Um, and this is so evident indeed, if you make these comparisons. And there are, in fact, so many other changes that we have, so many perspectives that we forget. And at this point in history, it's kind of incredible, because it's as if we were forgetting that there are other people while we actually live among them. Because I don't know, I know many people from other countries, and they all have different perceptions, and it's very interesting to get to know them, even when we come from actually close countries, because in that sense you have more in common, and the differences that you can highlight are more subtle, and yet in this sense are more interesting, more even deeper if you want, than you would expect. Um, the another big criterion on to which periodizing the Middle Ages is the nature of the sources. Um, so it's pretty obvious, for instance, that the beginning of the Middle Ages is a moment of silence of written tradition, mostly. Um, and this is a problem for us in strictly historical terms, but it didn't mean that, that since something was not written, there was no other alternative language to writing. Um, so it's also very important when you study history to think at how people communicated at the time. In our modern perspective, if you don't find something written, you say, "Oh well, this was a desert. There was nothing there." This is completely false. It's simply that people communicated in other ways that you can't see because they didn't leave us any record. Um, they didn't leave us any record of themselves, but they still were pretty active. There's a great prejudice in the towards, especially in fact, the so-called Dark Ages, as if these were objectively the early medieval times were actually extremely dynamic moments. From their own perspective, was nothing, and it's beautiful to get into those few sources that there are, because from them you get actually so many hints and traces of a much more dynamic world than we often imagine. That is also incidentally an extremely familiar world. This is what strikes you in history. We are the same people. We're doing the same things. We're facing the same problems. In the essential. So, and these sources tell it really. Um, and early medieval times are indeed much closer to ancient times in terms of um, method of research, mm? And they require this extremely refined, exegetic um, intelligence and also inventivity, methodological inventivity, because you have a few things you have to make them work out some way. Instead, if you find already something systematic, like in the low Middle Ages, where you have those books that were written in that way, that are several, they're made all in that fashion, you already have a track to say, okay, let's start in here. And that's tricky because it's obviously you know more about that period and it can be more accurate, but at the same time it's you get polarized by that system, and you can't think there was something else. In this sense, who studies the early medieval times has also other faults, I would say. And I'm speaking this because I studied low medieval times, telling the truth, and I abandoned early medieval history. I have to justify it. No, I'm kidding, of course. But has in sometimes he's required or she's required with much more inventivity. They're much more logical in many ways, because they have a fewer bases and they can't go much elsewhere. So they need to make them, to cope with this thing in a very pragmatical way. Many times, very logical, very direct. Um, Another very interesting point is, relatively to low medieval times in terms of sources, is that writing starts, is revived, also with many different aims. For instance, there is an end, definitely, chiefly towards the 13th century, also depending on which country of Europe we're talking about. When basically the church stops having a monopoly on writing. Mm. People talk about documentary revolution. That is, I don't like the term revolution, if not, when you in any case, telling the truth. But it's mm, this is kind of accurate sometimes, because even some systems of writing are sometimes they astonish you because they pop out sometimes out of the blue. Even certain linguistical choices. I mean, there are countries where, for instance, the vernacular starts to become a literary language from a really from a few years to another, and this changed so many things. Also in the ways things were written, because you don't write, and you don't build a medieval book if you're writing it in the same way if you're writing it in Latin or you're writing it in vernacular. There are so many changes, there are so many different canons. And what is interesting about the Low Middle Ages, in my opinion, is also the differentiation of the texts, obviously. So that writing, by the way, and this stems also from, among many other things, for one evident factor is that writing was not used immediately with a practical, with a sacral purpose, was not symbolic. You know that the Middle Ages basically begin with this moment when the book is more like a status symbol than something was actually read. I discussed it recently on, I think the video is called Literacy in Early Medieval Europe, and but there was another one. Yeah, also literary production in early medieval Europe, 6th, 11th century can be useful. So at this point, writing comes into, much, it spreads everywhere. So you have to distinguish also the kind of the motives for which people chose different types of writing, different genres, different canons, and so on. So it's very difficult. I don't know how this video turned out, if I was to jumping around from a topic to another, but I think today the Middle Ages are conceived like a big container. I know it sounds so bad, but it's sometimes it's natural, because also so much pops out from the Middle Ages continuously. So it's not something that we are still. It's even difficult to systematize, because it's there is still so much to know more. So this is also partly why we tend to lack a perspective of the world, because in the meanwhile there are so many other things to discover, and sometimes this happens also for economical reasons. People, how sadly the academy works and so on, but it is true, we still have to figure out the Middle Ages, because there is so much to know. There are so many sources. You can understand it in European libraries how many books still haven't been studied, because yes, someone surely came, kind of leafed through, browsed them, but it didn't actually analyze them properly one by one. There's so much to know. We can have the most unimaginable things still coming out from the medieval sources, and of course, not medieval history is not changed radically, but we can essentially get such a better knowledge, such a better picture of it than with the one we have it still today. And fortunately, and it's beautiful to have this awareness, because it means that and also medieval history is continuously getting reconsidered. Sometimes you get amazed to hear how many things that still haven't been properly still studied or deepened or analyzed, and there is a lot of room for medieval studies, and I think medieval studies are overall growing in the world. Sometimes it's a bit of a. I hate when the Middle Ages are in fact instrumentalized. They uh, they when people are attracted by the Middle Ages, especially by only because of. Uh, to make the long story short, there are many people who make undeservedly money through the Middle Ages, like even indulging in old cliches and stereotypes just to attract the average person that still believes in them. So unfortunately, this happens for every historical content in many ways, and but I believe there is a greater historical awareness. Even through the internet, I realize there are many people who get interested in the Middle Ages and many other things, and it's fine because initially, I think we went a very long way from this. I mean, today, I don't think I make great videos, but if you go on YouTube, you can find so many things about these topics that up to I don't know 10 years ago you couldn't find, and you couldn't even imagine that it could be. So it's interesting because at least we maybe we know less. We are becoming a bit more ignorant, or not. Maybe no. I think actually we're getting more educated, but not necessarily better educated. Um, the the point it's an increasing quantity, not in quality yet, and this is what we have to cope with in our. But at least when you want to search for a certain content, you realize everything is much easier than it was in the past. So technically, everybody can learn to from these things and in forming a personal opinion. This is a risk also because you can maybe get focused on the details and not on the wall, like we were saying in this video. But at the same time, it maybe the detail tells you that things are always more complicated. So this pushes you to kind of get rid of the old um, approximations and trying to form it to find something on your own. And actually, I'm kind of optimistic, telling the truth, relatively to the evolution of education in the future, because now we are in the real mess, because it's the moment in which we had the first impact with certain means of communication, with certain approaches to knowledge and so on. But in the future, we will try definitely to make this systemic, and when it will become a system, that will be something that will change it. Once again, we'll need to break it down. So it's always the same old story, actually. But it's still important. The most important thing is that we better things, or that we at least try to become more, to have more knowledge, more wisdom, which is perhaps the most important thing. Excuse me. So, and it's a paradox, though, that I still can't help but being worried by the lack of this unitary sense of the Middle Ages, that we're essentially getting rid of the Middle Ages. And it's beautiful because we're abandoning the word Middle Ages to many people who make a poor use of it. So as historians, I believe we shouldn't lack the unitary picture of of the concept of Middle Ages, not to make it being stolen by other people who make a very bad use of it. Because this is a word that is too rich in either negative or positive prejudices. It evokes this, dark, gloomy pictures, or even, light, bright ones, but that have, however, to do more, have to do more with the perception rather than the reality of that epoch. And that's why I'm generally happy when people get passionate about medieval themed topics. At the same time, I also go against those people who tend to present the Middle Ages in too brighter perspective. Too brighter perspective, because I think that's also anti-historical. There are many people now who are exalted about certain medieval times without even understanding them. So many fans of TV shows, TV series that objectively have, get obsessed by this thing. I don't know. Maybe they eventually they will be able to grow and to to see how. But sometimes it's just fanatism, in my opinion, and it doesn't render a good service to history. And this is not fault of people who make those TV shows or things, if not in part, because maybe sometimes they indulge too much into showing certain things that are more meant to exalt people than actually make them understand something. And it's obvious because basically our marketing works on the emotional effects. The more that's how our mind works, through emotions and symbols. So if you gain them a very strong emotion with a very strong characterized symbol, people are gonna remember that, and they're gonna pay for it. They're gonna get interested. So that's how people make money. But that's exactly the point. Sometimes these emotions and these symbols are wrong in the way they are delivered, because they're not correct historically speaking. So I wish I don't know, one of my greatest dreams would be to direct an historically themed movie, just to try to express certain things that I think are important and that also cinema doesn't take into consideration, because it's all about making lots of money, not making a cultural impact or doing something positive for it, for the world. Um, and especially I hate this distorted Middle Ages, especially in journalism, when people use terms like medieval or Byzantine in negative terms, like it just kind of disgusts me. Or even in certain movies or in certain novels, there is a lot of historical novels that are utter rubbish, for instance, or people who self-proclaim, I don't know, historical experts that get it all wrong, or even certain reenactments. I think reenactment is very important, actually, especially when concerning HEMA and knowing how certain medieval combat work. I have a great respect for those people who, through their own initiative, start this lifestyle objectively. But and I've met some reenactors who are very good historians as well, but some of them are just nuts, telling the truth, and they have very and sometimes I don't like many reenactments. And let's leave aside those medieval festivals that are really trash, those things like just for selling food and this. They can be nice maybe, but and can attract. I don't see any total absolute negative character of it, but it's still, they could do so much better, because it's fine that you get people interested in the Middle Ages, you let them think about the Middle Ages, fine, it's a very good starting point, but you can do better, especially given the resources you employ to that. You can sensibly make better at all levels, in movies, in festivals, in reenactments. We can all do better in general in this world, but it doesn't happen. And it's also fine to criticize this, how these things are carried out, because they can help them make better. And in fact, if you see overall, I believe that also certain certain movies are kind of starting to get it really right. Obviously, their fiction is not reality by definition, and it will never be. There is no, just if you want to learn history, switch the TV off and study a book, because that's the only way you can hope to get the closest to what it was really like. There is no movie, no fiction, no reenactment that shows you what the reality was. No one, not even a single one. And most of them are just systemically wrong. So I urge you, I think I advise you, I'd say better, to always appreciate naturally the effort, the artistical value, and all these stuffs are very, very important. If I watch a historical movie, for instance, I don't spend all the time complaining, oh, that's wrong, that's not accurate. So I just enjoy the movie for what it is. If it's entertaining, if it's artistically well done, yeah. But I stopped there, and I take a movie the way it is. The problem is when people take movies for the Bible of history. That's not it. And it's so extremely widespread now, and I know it's like shooting on the Red Cross, because yeah, we know that not all people know that much about history, so I don't want to sound as if I am the guy who speaks about these things, and so I feel myself to be rather ignorant, telling the truth, and Um, you also realize I'm not so extremely sophisticated in my videos as well, but that's also um, it's also important that we can improve. We can all improve everything we do, and I try to make these videos to spread essentially historical awareness uh, in a very humble way, because I realize I don't have the time to do things extremely professional fun, but it would be also maybe boring, so I have to compensate all these need to deliver content that can, however, do some good, because this is ultimately my interest in this activity. Aside from what I can profit from it, but which is a very few, let me tell you. And but you can be sure that even if I'll get to, I will never bend my historical opinions on someone else's, for need of, I don't know, because they will. I will always stay true to myself. I think more even more than you, as I feel actually the responsibility for what I say, and I often make mistakes, so it's not really a surprise, and it shouldn't be for you. But at the same time, I still hope to do something that helps to make people just a bit more aware. If I made it even for a single person, I know it was all worth it, and I will keep doing it for this very reason. So when we think about the Middle Ages, we get this idea of this medieval, these horrors, these fears, these terrible nightmares, as if our times didn't generate even much worse objectively, which was better according to the 20th century or the 13th. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people being slaughtered into the 20th century, so this is not very comforting. The we have to think in terms of context. We can't make also here easy comparisons, but that's something still you have to reflect on. And what about nostalgia of a Middle Ages made up um, by gnomes and fairies and this heroic holiness and noble feelings and courtly love and strong solidarity, and this is not reality. History is not, and also the Middle Ages is such that is not a ground on which we have to project our dreams or to search for alibis for feeling ourselves better, because this is also true. This happens all the time. We look at history to feel ourselves better, to feel ourselves superior. This is how the same concept of Middle Ages started. A bunch of humanists were fed up by fed by the by their tyrants, began to write and to have the time to go around for libraries and picking Roman sources and getting in love with them and saying, oh, this previous century sucked, let's give it a name, the Middle Ages, yeah, boo, the Middle Ages, and so on. This is not right. We are not better than people who lived in the Middle Ages. Forget to be more capable or more intelligent than a medieval person, because you're most likely not, and you will most likely never be. The only Middle Ages, in my opinion, should be the one of, or maybe this is also pretty arrogant to say, but I think if you really want to get close to the Middle Ages, because you have a passion, you feel you love it, you feel you're interested in it, you're just curious, you want to know more, you want to give it a try, let's say. This should be the Middle Ages of the historians. So these weird people that spend all their lives you know, breaking, you know, not really breaking their back, but staying, losing their, getting their legs atrophied and their eyes, their sight declining over these fragments, these documents, these things that just for figuring out with great fatigue this how to interpret rightly these sources. And and instead we should get rid completely of these false Middle Ages, the one of the prejudices, of the commonplaces, of the stereotypes, um, which paradoxically is probably the truest Middle Ages in terms of what we have built with the concept of Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a living stereotype as a term, as a definition. We should simply to get rid of it. This is the point. We because it's what it's a creation of the humanists. That's what it is, and that's what our world has ever since that point considered the Middle Ages like. And this is a shame. This is terrible, and so naturally looking at history, we can't get it epurated from commonplaces and stereotypes and prejudices, because this is ultimately how the human mind works. This doesn't mean to justify this way of thinking, but it means also to understand what the limits of human nature are, indeed. But we should take the Middle Ages as a work, history as a work, and as an exercise for our mind, for getting more cultured, but also at the same time for even with a civil duty, because we all feel the need to make this world better, and the best way is to understand this world. If you don't study history, you can't understand this world, so you're gonna make many damages, not because people repeat always the same mistakes of the past. People never repeat the same mistakes of the past. By definition, it's past, it's not present, it's not the same thing. History never repeated itself, not even once, but that's exactly the point. It always changes. And if you stop looking at what happened in the past, you can't figure out how it's gonna be now. And you're gonna make mistakes. So those are the mistakes. Those are the unseen, the what still has not happened, because it's you who can make it. And history helps you, and the Middle Ages help you. And I think especially the Middle in our times, probably the most useful age in history for us to understand is the Middle Ages, because there are so many similarities with what is going on that can help us understand our world better. And maybe there are so many answers that we can find to the Middle Ages that never get to an answer, never get to that fixed answer, but just keep searching for them, and the Middle Ages will talk to you, and they will tell you so many beautiful, beautiful things. So just stay open, just put everything you know into discussion, because if you lose criticism towards yourself, you're done. You're useless. If you want to be useless in your life, stop being critical towards things you know. Just believe in fixed realities and truths and so on. Never say. And a medieval person would have never done it. I just tell you this. A medieval person would always remain capable of thinking it through, of saying, in spite of of his or her own ignorance, in spite of the problem, the questions, that's something a medieval person would have always posed to him or herself, always. And I think we owe them so much, because after all, if we are here, it's also thanks to them. And I think that if they hoped, these people are past now, so they all had their death, they all had their suffering, they all had their share, and maybe they died with the hope of making this world better. And I think we owe them something, just because they broke their backs, that they sweated and teared, ultimately also for leaving us what we have today. And we could give them a bit more of credit than what we normally do, by using these stupid terms like the Dark Ages, this terrible obscure moment, and so on. And this doesn't mean we feel the need to embellish it either. We have to be real, we have to be objective, we have to be honest and sincere with ourselves. So let's get rid of these prejudices about the Middle Ages, because they are wrong morally for us, and we can do so much better if we only could read all through the medieval times and get moved and I think and crying because of what they can tell us, because we will never be able to thank the medievals enough for what they've left us, I believe. And probably the best way we can achieve this is, first of all, getting rid of the word Middle Ages. Let's get rid of it. Let's forget about it when we are learning about it. Let's think that it's a big lie, and that we have to let's say unmask and to punish the liar in this sense, and getting it right, and at our own benefit. We don't have to do it for no one else but ourselves. So these were my thoughts now, just to, I don't know, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like and or subscribe to my channel, which, if you are interested, especially in my upcoming contents, because you can get them straight from the notifications, then seeing it on your own page. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.